Okay, so today, June 14th, 2026, Donald Trump signed a peace deal with Iran. And right now, every major news channel, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, they are all running the same footage. The handshake, the ceremony, the flags, breaking news banners everywhere. Markets are up, people are celebrating, and the headline is simple: the war is over. That is the wrong story. Because while the cameras were pointed at the signing table, I want you to look at something else. I want you to look at a man whose name you have almost certainly never heard. His name is Ghulam Hossein Mohseni Ejei. He is Iran's judiciary chief. He is not a diplomat. He is not a general. He does not negotiate. What he does is this. He decides who gets arrested in Iran. He controls the prison system. He's the man who determines whether Iran's own negotiators go home tonight or go to a cell. And on June 13th, one day before this deal was signed, he made a public statement. He said Iran's confrontation with America will have, and I am quoting him directly, no end except with the uprooting of oppression and arrogance. No end. Not a pause, not a ceasefire. No end. Now I want you to think about something. When the person who controls whether your peace negotiators get arrested says there will be no peace, what does the piece of paper they just signed actually mean? Today, I want to show you a framework I call the jailer's veto. And once you see it, you will never watch a diplomatic ceremony the same way again. And I want to show you three other things that nobody on television is connecting today. The first is why the jailer's veto is not unique to Iran. It is a structural feature of every authoritarian system that has ever tried to negotiate with the West, and it has killed more peace deals than any missile ever has. The second is why the specific architecture of this deal, the sequencing, the language, the 60-day window, was designed in a way that guarantees the jailer's veto will be used. And the third thing, and this is the one that matters most for the next 6 months, is what Iran has been doing with the time that this negotiation has already bought them. Because while diplomats were talking, engineers were working. And what they were working on changes the entire strategic picture in ways that the signing ceremony you just watched on television does not begin to address. Okay, let's start with the framework. Part 1. The jailer's veto. In any political system, real power does not always sit where the cameras point. In democratic systems, we understand this intuitively. We know that lobbyists, central bankers, and intelligence agencies often have more influence over policy than elected officials. We talk about the deep state. We talk about institutional inertia. We understand that a president cannot simply will something into existence just because they want it. But here is what most Western analysts fail to apply when they look at Iran. Iran is not a simple dictatorship where one man gives orders and everyone obeys. Iran is a layered system. And in that layered system, there is a specific category of actor that I want you to understand today. I call them jailers. Not because they literally run prisons, though in this case the judiciary chief literally does. I call them jailers because their institutional power is the power to punish anyone who moves too far toward compromise. Think about how this works in practice. Abbas Araghchi is Iran's foreign minister. He's a diplomat. He's sophisticated. He has been sitting across the table from American negotiators for weeks. He genuinely wants to find a framework that relieves economic pressure on Iran. He is trying to make a deal. But Araghchi knows something that the American negotiators across the table from him do not feel in their bones the way he does. He knows that there is a ceiling on how far he can go. Not a formal ceiling, not a written rule. A ceiling defined by the question, if I sign this, will I be arrested when I get home? And the person who answers that question is not the supreme leader. It is not the IRGC commander. It is the judiciary chief. Because the judiciary chief is the one who decides what counts as treason, what counts as collaboration with the enemy, what counts as crossing the line that separates a pragmatic negotiator from a compromiser who betrayed the revolution. On June 13th, 2026, one day before the signing ceremony you just watched, Ghulam Hossein Mohseni Ijei exercised the jailer's veto in public. He did not veto the signing. He cannot do that directly. What he did was send a signal that is crystal clear to everyone inside Iran's system, even if it is invisible to everyone watching CNN. He said the confrontation with America will have no end. He said this publicly, on the record, as the head of the institution that decides who gets prosecuted. And the message inside that statement, decoded for the people who need to decode it, is this: anyone who signs something that ends this confrontation on terms that look like surrender will answer for it. Now, does that mean Arakchi will be arrested tomorrow? No. Does it mean the deal is instantly dead? No. What it means is that the deal just got a ceiling put on it. Every technical negotiation that happens in the next 60 days, every concession Iran's diplomatic team might be willing to make, every compromise they might find their way to on the uranium question, on Hormuz management, on the axis of resistance, every single one of those potential concessions now has to pass through an invisible filter. Would making this concession give Ejei the justification to come after me? And when the answer to that question is yes, the concession does not happen. That is the jailer's veto. And it is the most important thing you need to understand about why this deal, whatever it says on paper, has a structural ceiling that was set before the ink dried. Part 2. Why this deal was built to hit that ceiling. Now, I want to walk you through the architecture of the deal itself, because I think when you look at the specific structure of what was agreed today, you will see that the jailer's veto was not an external threat to this agreement. It was baked into the design. Here is what the Memorandum of Understanding actually requires. On Iran's side, the obligations are specific, measurable, and front-loaded. Iran agrees to open the Strait of Hormuz immediately. Iran agrees to remove all naval mines within 30 days. Iran agrees to begin technical negotiations on its nuclear program within the 60-day window. These are not vague commitments. These are concrete actions with timelines. Iran has to do things first. Now look at what the United States commits to. The United States will gradually ease its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Gradually. That word is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, because gradually has no timeline. It has no benchmark. It has no verification mechanism. It is a promise to maybe do something at some unspecified point if circumstances allow. And here is where the jailer's veto becomes the structural problem. Iran's diplomatic team looked at this asymmetry. They saw it. They are not naive. And they accepted it anyway, because they were under enormous economic pressure and they needed some relief. But when they went back to Tehran to explain what they had agreed to, they walked into a room where Ejei had already told the country that the confrontation has no end. They walked into a room where IRGC commanders are publicly calling Arakchi a compromiser. They walked into a room where hardline newspapers are running front-page articles saying Hormuz was closed with power and will not be opened with diplomacy. In that room, the diplomatic team cannot go back and ask for less. They cannot soften Iran's position further to make the deal more workable, because the jailer is watching, and the jailer has already defined the floor below which no Iranian official can go without risking prosecution. So what happens? The deal gets signed. The ceremony happens. The markets react. And then the 60 days begin. And in those 60 days, the technical negotiations on the nuclear question run immediately into the wall that everyone who has studied this knows was always going to be there. America demands Iran hand over 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. Iran says the enrichment program is a red line. That gap cannot be bridged in 60 days. It cannot be bridged in 60 months. Because bridging it requires Iran to make a concession that the jailer has already defined as treason.
And when the 60 days expire and the nuclear talks collapse, America will say Iran negotiated in bad faith. Iran will say America never intended to lift the blockade. Both statements will contain a version of the truth. And the deal that everyone celebrated today, will quietly die. Not with a bang, with a shrug, with both sides walking away from a table that was never going to produce what it promised. This is not speculation. This is the architecture. The deal was built on a foundation that the jailer's veto had already undermined before the first negotiating session ever happened. Part 3. What Iran was actually doing while everyone was watching the table. Now, I want to tell you about the third thing. The thing that, in my view, is actually the most consequential development of the past several weeks. And it is something that has received almost no serious analysis in the Western press, because the Western press has been entirely focused on the question of whether the deal would be signed. While the deal was being negotiated, Iran was doing something else, something physical, something that cannot be undone by any diplomatic agreement, no matter what language it uses. CNN reported, based on 5 separate American intelligence sources, that during the negotiation period, Iran was actively collapsing tunnels at its nuclear facilities in Isfahan. And not just collapsing them, placing explosive mines around the entrances. We are talking about 440 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60%, enough for approximately 11 nuclear weapons, now buried under collapsed rock and surrounded by landmines.
Let me be very precise about what this action means strategically. It means that the uranium is no longer retrievable by any conventional military operation. It means that even if Trump ordered B-2 stealth bombers to go and physically retrieve the material, as he reportedly threatened to do, the material is not accessible. It is not a matter of will or firepower. It is a matter of physics. The tunnels are collapsed. The mines are in place. To get to that uranium, you would need to conduct an operation of such scale and duration that it would be impossible to execute covertly and would trigger exactly the kind of escalation that makes the entire exercise pointless. Now, here is what I want you to understand about the timing of this action. Iran did not collapse those tunnels after the deal fell apart. Iran did not collapse those tunnels as a negotiation tactic to demonstrate leverage. Iran collapsed those tunnels while negotiations were actively ongoing. While Arakchi was sitting across the table from American diplomats talking about the future of the nuclear program, Iranian engineers were burying the most sensitive component of that program under rubble and explosives.
What does that tell you? It tells you that Iran's diplomatic team and Iran's military establishment were running 2 completely parallel processes simultaneously. The diplomatic team was buying time. They were keeping America at the table long enough for the military establishment to make the uranium physically irretrievable. The negotiation was not an attempt to resolve the nuclear question. The negotiation was the cover under which the nuclear question was being permanently removed from the table by other means. And now the deal is signed, and the 60-day clock is running. And somewhere in the tunnels of Isfahan, under collapsed rock and explosive charges, sits enough enriched uranium to change the course of world history. And no diplomatic agreement, not this one, not the next one, not the one after that, is going to change what the engineers did while the diplomats were talking. This is what I mean when I say the jailer's veto is not just about who gets arrested. It is about the gap between what is said at the table and what is done away from it. The jailer sets the ceiling on what diplomats can concede. The engineers set the floor on what military capacity Iran will retain regardless of what the diplomats agree to. And the deal you watched being signed today, exists in the space between that ceiling and that floor. And that space is much smaller than the ceremony suggested. The case that I am wrong. Now, I want to do something I always do. I want to give you the strongest possible argument against everything I have just said, because intellectual honesty requires it, and because I genuinely believe the only way to think clearly about anything is to take the opposing view seriously. Here is the steel man. Professor, you are overweighting the hardliners. Every political system has factions. Every negotiation happens over the objection of somebody who thinks it goes too far. The fact that EJ made a hardline statement the day before the signing does not mean the signing was meaningless. It means there are factions in Iran who oppose the deal, which is true of every deal in every country in every era of modern history. The JCPOA was signed over the objections of hardliners in 2015. The Camp David Accords were signed over the objections of hardliners in 1978. The Good Friday Agreement was signed over the objections of hardliners in 1998. Hardliners always oppose deals.
That does not mean deals cannot hold. And furthermore, the argument that Iran was fortifying its nuclear sites while negotiating does not prove bad faith. Every country maintains and develops its military capabilities during negotiations. The United States did not stop producing weapons systems while negotiating the JCPOA. Russia did not stop developing military technology while participating in the Minsk agreements. Maintaining your capacity during negotiations is not evidence of deception. It is evidence of strategic prudence. And finally, the economic pressure on Iran is real. The Iranian people are suffering. The rial has collapsed. Inflation is at levels that are genuinely destabilizing. And the Iranian government, including the hardliners, needs some economic relief. A deal that provides that relief, even an imperfect one, has value to both sides. The ratchet effect is real. Once you have signed something, the political cost of going back to war increases. That matters. That is the steel man. It is not a weak argument. It has historical precedent and internal logic.
But here is what the steel man cannot explain. Gaddafi complied. He gave up his weapons program completely. He cooperated with Western intelligence. He did everything that was asked of him. And 8 years later, he was killed when NATO supported the campaign to overthrow him. The Iranian parliament knows this history. The IRGC knows this history. The Judiciary chief knows this history. When AJ says the confrontation has no end, he is not just expressing ideological conviction. He is drawing a lesson from the pattern of how the United States treats countries that give up their deterrence. And the uranium in those tunnels is not a negotiating chip that Iran buried to create leverage it can later trade away. It is an insurance policy that Iran buried because the lesson of Libya, the lesson of Iraq, the lesson of their own experience with the JCPOA is that the moment you give up your hard security assets in exchange for American promises, the promises evaporate and the assets are gone forever. The engineers were not acting in defiance of the diplomats. The engineers were acting on the same strategic logic that every Iranian official, hardliner and pragmatist alike, has internalized from 45 years of dealing with Washington. The steel man says hardliners always oppose deals, and deals hold anyway. What it cannot explain is why this time the hardliners are not just opposing the deal politically, they are physically restructuring the military landscape to make certain aspects of the deal's requirements impossible to fulfill, regardless of what happens at the negotiating table.
That is not normal factional opposition. That is structural sabotage, and it was happening while the ink was being prepared. 3 things to watch in the next 72 hours. Okay, let me give you something concrete. Not just analysis, but a framework you can test against reality in real time. Because the real value of any geopolitical model is not whether it sounds compelling in a video. It is whether it predicts what happens next. Watch number 1. Israel and Lebanon. Iran's position throughout these negotiations has been that any deal must include a comprehensive ceasefire in Lebanon. This was not a peripheral demand. It was a core condition. Abbas Araghchi said it explicitly on Iranian state television on June 12th.
Iran demands a permanent ceasefire in Lebanon,